Thank you. So I hope you've thought long and hard about the definition. As we know, different groups are always obsessed with controlling female clothing. My wife has interesting stories about when she was a schoolgirl and the nuns were going around with tape measures to make sure that skirts were long enough. And Maristella was telling me that the project in Florida wouldn't go down very well in Brazil because the covering of the buttocks on Brazilian beaches is often minimal. They have a bikini bottom, you may know, which is called fio dental, which is dental floss. That wouldn't satisfy the people in Florida. In fact, I was remembering when our daughter was 14 years old, at the end of the 80s, we went to France and we went to a beach near Cannes. And the beach was full of women bare-breasted. Nobody was looking at them at all. They were all looking at our daughter, who had a covered top, but she had a Brazilian bottom, and everybody was amazed that she was so uncovered. And so these conventions are different, as we know. But here, Florida wanted to have some degree of decency for the dancers. But as I say, if you come up with a statement that buttocks have to be covered, you then have to define buttocks in order to ensure that they are covered. So the legislators were faced with the task of defining. I wondered if anybody had any ideas about how to approach this difficult linguistic task. Or do you assume anybody knows what a covered buttock looks like? Let's see what the legislators actually did. You think somebody will offer us a definition? No? Right, here you are. You can enjoy this. Buttocks are the area at the rear of the human body, sometimes referred to as the gluteus maximus, which lies between two imaginary lines running parallel to the ground. Okay, so we've got a line here and a line here. Yep. Parallel to the ground when a person is standing. So if you're testing the dancer, you have to get her to stand up first of all. The first or top of such lines being 1/2 inch below the top of the vertical cleavage of the nates, i.e. the prominence formed by the muscles running from the back of the hip to the back of the leg. And the second or bottom line being 1/2 inch above the lowest point of the curvature of the fleshy protuberance, sometimes referred to as the gluteal fold, and also between two imaginary lines, one on each side of the body, the outside lines, which outside lines are perpendicular to the ground and to the horizontal lines described above, and which perpendicular outside lines pass through the outermost points at which each nate meets the outer side of each leg. So, as I say, the police officers would then have no difficulty with this particular task. Sometimes, as expert witnesses or peritos, we get involved in interpretation or definition of words in legal text. As I say, usually it's quite difficult. But here's a classic case from the States from the 1980s in which a famous and now sadly long dead linguist was involved. Some of you may know her work, although she's been dead for a long time. Her name was Ellen Prince. You may know her husband more, who works on narrative analysis. But the question in this case was, a man took out health insurance, and 18 months after he took out the health insurance, he needed to claim. He was declared unfit for work, so he made a claim on his health insurance. And the insurance company declined his claim. They declined it because they said when he filled in the form, he had lied. So if you lie on an insurance form, then the insurance is invalid. One of the problems was the word impairment, because there was a question which said, have you any impairments? Now, impairment is a difficult word for me. I'm not exactly sure what an impairment is. When he said that he hadn't lied, the insurance company justified their decision. They said he had said no to impairments. They said, I don't have any impairments. And they said, but at the time that you took out the proposal, you were overweight, you had occasional back pains, and you had high blood pressure. Now, I've got all those three problems. But if anybody asked me if I had any impairments, I would also say no. So the question is, would we both have been lying? In other words, what is an impairment? Now, the insurance company was saying, we wrote the document and we know what an impairment is, and what you've got, overweight, back pains and blood pressure, count as impairments. What Ellen Prince did was to say, you can't do that. You can't simply say, this is what my text means. The text has to communicate with the intended audience, and the intended audience is people like this man, who was a labourer. He didn't have a particularly good education. You can't produce texts which are not clear and then say, you failed because you didn't understand. So he said, let's look at the text as collaborative readers. What would a collaborative reader, somebody who's not trying to misinterpret, what would a collaborative reader make of this text? And one of the crucial questions was, have you any impairments? So I say, I would have said no, particularly when the question is followed by what look like explanatory examples. Have you any impairments? Loss of sight or hearing? Loss of arm or leg? Are you crippled or deformed? So what I say to myself, I'm not sure what impairment means, but here it obviously means something serious. Loss of sight, loss of an arm, being impaired or deformed. Not nice words, but if you say, well, no, I don't fall into that category, so that must be what the text means by impairment, and so I answer no. So the defence of the company was that wasn't our intention. We meant by impairment virtually everything. But eventually the judge was willing to accept this. And so the company were told that they had to pay out, because in the interpretation that any collaborative reader would make, you couldn't see impairment as referring to high blood pressure, to being overweight and having occasional backaches, as he had never lost a single day at work. So they were not impairing his ability to do his job, and therefore that definition was unacceptable. Interestingly, and I think I mentioned this before, the plain language movement, which has been particularly successful in the Anglophone countries, is now ensuring that texts of this kind are much more understandable. So in my lifetime I've bought 3 houses, and each time it's become easier to understand the contract that I've signed, that the contracts are becoming much more understandable. And one of my colleagues bought a house about 3 years ago, and it was almost in plain text that the things are, the lawyers are being pushed to communicate much more successfully with lay audiences. In fact, there was a law in the States, I think it was around about February 2013, which said in future all contracts must be in a easy to understand format. Doesn't mean to say the lawyer still can't do nasty things to you. Have a look. I'm sure everybody here, or almost everybody here, has a Facebook account. Have a look at your Facebook contract. Almost everybody simply clicks, I have read and accept, and almost everybody lies with these. At one point, I don't know how long it is now, but at one point the Facebook contract was 53 pages long. And when I talked to my students in Florianopolis, not a single one of them knew that they had signed away the right to all their photographs. When I said to them, look, you've got a photograph of yourself in a bikini on the beach. You could be driving down the road someday and suddenly find yourself advertising beer or suntan lotion or something, because you've given away the right to any images that you post on Facebook. Oh, really? Yeah. So it's interesting to look at contracts and see, can you understand it? And if you can understand it, are you really happy to sign it? One of the things that happens with book contracts is that the book contract always signs away all your rights. And this happens with many international journals. You sign away your right to reproduction to the international journal. I always put a little bit in handwriting saying that I retain copyright, because otherwise you might find yourself in a position where you have to pay the publisher to republish your own work. But if you don't read the contracts, you might discover later that unfortunate things have happened. With my introduction to forensic linguistics, I was wanting to do a translation into Portuguese. But even though I wrote it, I can't do that without the permission from the publisher. And the publisher will insist on a fee for me translating my own text before I can publish it. Because what I wanted to do was to produce a translation which we could give away free. But I can give it away, but I have to pay for the privilege of giving it away. So, one needs to look very carefully at the contracts. I think I may miss out the next step because I may not have enough time to do them. If I do, we'll come back. But let me just tell you about them. Most countries have a special legal text which in English is called a temporary restraining order. It's used when a couple are in a violent relationship and one of the couple goes to court to ask for protection. In Britain, it's almost always women, but apparently 8% of the cases are husband battering rather than wife battering. And what the court does is it produces a document of this kind, which says to the violent partner, we are putting these restrictions on your behaviour, and if you don't follow these restrictions, you could be imprisoned. So it's an attempt legally to separate the couple for a period in order to see if the relationship will become calmer. Now, these documents, again, are usually produced by lawyers and are usually legally secure, but communicatively difficult. And there have been many cases of men being convicted of breaking the order and being sent to prison and claiming, yes, I did what I've been accused of, but I didn't realise I wasn't able to do that. In other words, they were claiming that what they had was a communicative or interpretive problem. I didn't understand that the text I was given meant that I couldn't do that. Now, they may or may not be true, but when one looks at these texts, some of them are certainly less than clear. And if there were time, we might come back to this, because I wanted to report an interesting piece of research in Tennessee, where a linguist was asked to look at a couple of these orders, because the police had had several men claiming we didn't understand them, and they rewrote it, and the men said we still don't understand them. So what he did was he did a piece of research with his students to find out whether the students understood them. And surprise, surprise, even the students who were, as a group, linguistically more competent than the average wife beater, they also had problems with interpreting the text. So if we've got time, we'll come back to that. But the third thing that I wanted to talk about was product warnings. What kind of warning do you get when you buy a product? And one of my PhD students is working on this. She's been working on this for about 18 months now, looking at different kinds of products. Particularly at the moment, she's looking at medicines. Although in the last fortnight she's suddenly changed, because she's discovered that her 3-year-old daughter has diabetes. And now she's focusing on product labels that tell you about sugar and carbohydrate. And what she's finding is that as someone who's trying to buy products for someone suffering from diabetics, it's not particularly easy to find out on the product whether it's actually got things that are dangerous for the diabetic. So she's likely to move her research slightly, because I always like my students to not simply be doing academic research, but be doing research which can affect the community as well. So as far as possible, we like to go outside the university gates and do something which could improve the life of somebody. But what we're finding, not surprisingly, is that in product warnings, the manufacturer is much more concerned with protecting him or herself than protecting the consumer. So often you go and you find that the person is protected, but you're not sure what you have to do yourself to avoid the problems. And what we've got here, one of the most famous and probably the first real forensic linguist is somebody you may know in other areas, a man called Roger Shy, who used to work in multilingualism and applied linguistics. And later in life he did more and more cases as a forensic linguist. But one of the things that he wrote when he was working on a case was that product warnings should identify and describe the nature and danger of the risk. Then they should tell the reader how to avoid it. And finally, they should communicate those things in clear and understandable language. So, we should know what the problem is, we should know how to avoid the problem, and it should be pretty clear for us. So here are one or two warnings that my student collected when she was on a stagio in England. Product warnings here. Take special care with Beecham's powders. Special. What is special care? Avoid excessive intake of caffeine. What is excessive? If you go to Brazil, excessive will have a very different definition from what you might have here. The coffee is stronger and more frequently. Wherever you go, if you go to the bank, you go to a shop, you go to a school, there's always coffee. There's coffee all the time. One of my colleagues worked for the British Council in Brazil for 5 years. And when he went back to England, he started trembling. And the doctor diagnosed caffeine withdrawal symptoms. And he realised that he was drinking 30 coffees a day. You know, little ones like this, but every time somebody came into his office, and that was every 20 minutes, he would say, "Would you like a coffee?" "Yes, I'd like a coffee." And this is standard interactional procedure. So excessive in Brazil would be very different from excessive in Britain, where perhaps 3 cups of coffee a day would be excessive. In Brazil, 20, more than 20, excessive. But you have to avoid it. And then the next one, risk of heart attack or stroke. Ibuprofen may increase the risk. May. Either it does or it doesn't. Well, it may. So what does the may depend on? Does it depend on me? Does it depend on other things that I'm taking? It covers the manufacturer, because the manufacturer, I told you, it may increase the risk. And what kind of risk? What might happen if it increases? What are the consequences? If we take large amounts, surely this comes in tablet form. Surely they can tell us what is large and what is not large. And for a long time. How long is a long time? You know, if you're taking antibiotics, it's usually 5 days, but it might be 10 days. But if I'm taking this because I've got a headache, how long is a long time? But don't worry, the risk is small. Even so, take the lowest amount, lowest. Large normally pairs with small, not with lowest, but got lowest amount for the shortest possible time to reduce this risk. Perhaps one should not take it at all. Yeah, that's what you begin to wonder. How can I interpret this text in order to use the medicine properly? And of course, unfortunately, texts of this kind are not always coherent. 2 years ago, I had a cough which wouldn't go away. So Carmen sent me to the doctor and said, go and ask him about this cough. And what he said to me is, it's nothing to worry about. It's a kind of allergic reaction. So I'm going to give you some medicine. And the medicine was called Histoblock. So obviously it's some kind of antihistamine. So I buy my medicine and I go home. And Carmen and I are an archetypal pair. Well, I know nothing about medicine and about medicines, and she knows a lot. So she says to you, can you drive? And I said, well, I assume so, because the doctor didn't tell me I couldn't drive, so I'm sure he would have told me I can't drive. Well, she said, what does the bula, I don't know what you call it, they call the leaflet inside the medicine a bula. So what does the bula say? Can I drive? So I approach my bula with a question, can I drive? And it tells me no effects have been observed on the capacity to drive automobiles or to work machines. So that's fine. I say, yes, I can drive. But we were going out to a party that evening, so I also want to know, can I drink? Using this medicine with alcohol doesn't increase the effects. That's great. Yes, I can drive and I can drink, even though the police don't want me to drink and drive, but I can do both. Are you sure? Says Carmen. So we read on. Further down, there's something under the heading précaution. Now, précaution, I assume, translates into English as caution. I'm not quite sure, but I think that's what it is. And it now says, during treatment, the patient shouldn't drive. Having said no effects were noticed, I'm now told I shouldn't drive because this could be prejudicial. At least it meant I couldn't help Carmen using the aspirador or any other machines, but it did say that I shouldn't drive. And then this bula is in terribly small writing, all the way down 2 sides on page 1, 2 columns on page 1, 2 columns on page 2. To the bottom, I thought I'd better read the whole bula now. At the bottom of page 2, there's a section only for medical professionals. So most of this is for the patient. There's a little bit for medical professionals. There's a warning, which I assume is stronger than a caution. I assume advertencia is stronger than précaution. It's the same instruction, but for the medical professional, it's been raised from warning, raised from caution to warning. Exactly the same message, but its strength has been increased. Now, it's this kind of thing that is worrying us about the medical leaflets we're looking at, but it worries us about all kinds of other things as well. How successfully are warnings being transmitted to the person who buys the product? Now, I'm going to talk to you about a case that I was involved in some 2 years ago. I was involved in at a distance. Sadly, it was a case in Canada, and I thought I might get to Canada to give evidence, but eventually we didn't get to court. A man bought a barbecue, a portable barbecue, functioning on, I think is it called propane or butane gas? It's a gas cylinder for outdoor use. He bought it. He installed it in a summer house at his beach house, and after 2 weeks it exploded. That is how it looked after the explosion. His son, who was in the room when it exploded, suffered third-degree burns, and the purchaser wanted to sue the producer for not giving him adequate warning about the barbecue. Now, not in Brazil, but in the States, there's much more control over the expressing of warnings to users. And there are seen to be 3 different levels of danger, each with a colour coding. So this is particularly good. We've got danger in red, warning in orange, caution in yellow, and then notice in blue. If something is labelled danger, this indicates a dangerous situation which will cause death or very serious injury. Will cause death. Warning is a dangerous situation which could cause death or very serious injury. Caution indicates a dangerous situation which could cause slight or moderate injury. And notice is information not concerned with bodily injury. As you can see on the next page of your handout, the barbecue came with 4 labels stuck onto it. One label says danger. It wasn't in red, but it said danger, and as we've seen here, danger indicates a dangerous situation which will cause death or very serious injury. Danger. Never store a spare liquid petroleum cylinder under or near this barbecue. Never fill the tank beyond 3/4 full. A fire causing death or serious injury may occur. So it tells us it's dangerous, and it tells us it could cause death. So we've got to be careful with the cylinder. Danger, again. Flammable gas under pressure, leaking LP gas may cause a fire or explosion, so that's the danger. Do not use or store this cylinder in a building, garage or enclosed area, okay? Caution. Now, remember, caution only indicates a dangerous situation which could cause slight or moderate injury. Use only the gas pressure regulator supplied with this appliance. This regulator is set for an outlet pressure, etc. So we've got 2 dangers and a caution. The 4th label says for outdoor use only. So the company say, you bought our barbecue. It says explicitly for outdoor use only, though remember what Shai said, it shouldn't tell you what the problem is, it should also tell you what will happen if you don't do it. So it says for outdoor use only, but it doesn't say what might happen if you use it inside. But then it says, if installed indoor, for outdoor use only. But then you go back and say, oh, well, it's only been certified for outdoor use. But apparently you can install it inside as well. If you do, you have to detach and leave the cylinder outdoors. What the man involved here did was he took the barbecue, he put it inside, but the cylinder stayed outside, and there was a pipe that went through the wall from the outside cylinder to the inside barbecue. So he says, "I've done what you told me to do," and it exploded. A fourth label was longer, and so in addition to that, it also had all this text, mainly about the surroundings to the barbecue. So it says, "Don't locate it under overhead, unprotected, combustible surfaces." So obviously, there's a possibility that the barbecue will flame if grease drops onto the flames, and so you have to make sure that there's nothing that could catch fire surrounding it. And then it tells us that it's not intended to be installed in or on recreational vehicles or boats. So obviously there's a problem with movement, but his wasn't moving, his was fixed. So this appears to allow for installation inside, even though it's only been certified for outside. The grill was accompanied by an instruction leaflet. And in the leaflet there are other things. It says, "Locate the grill only in a well-ventilated area. Do not install this unit into combustible enclosures." Now what he'd done, he'd not simply put it inside with the gas outside, but he'd also put in a ventilator. So there was a very strong industrial ventilator on top of the barbecue to suck away anything, and so it was a well-ventilated area. Now the next is potentially ambiguous. Never locate the grill in a building, but he did locate it in a building. Never locate the grill in a building, garage, breezeway, shed or other such enclosed areas without an approved ventilation system. He did have an approved ventilation system. So it looked as if everything was okay. And I wrote a report saying, even though we know the manufacturer intended this to be only used outside, the text that accompanied the barbecue permitted it to be used inside. Any cooperative reading of this text, because manufacturers pretend that they give you a leaflet and you read it from the beginning to the end, but most people don't do that. Most people say, "These are the questions I want to ask. Can I drive? Can I drink?" And you go to the text and look for answers. So I said that, in my opinion, any cooperative reader would discover that from the text you could do what he did, which was put it inside with a industrial ventilation and put the cylinder outside, because, as we saw, danger is only associated with the cylinder, not with the barbecue. It tells us the cylinder could explode. However, there was then a response from an expert employed by the company. And the expert made a lot of points, but only two substantial ones. What he said was that if installed doesn't mean if installed. What it means is if stored. This was a barbecue produced in China, and the leaflet was written by Chinese, and this apparently was a Chinese English mistake. What it should have said was if stored in store. So you could only use it outside, but you can store it inside, but even if you store it inside, you have to leave the cylinder outside. So the company admitted that this was a linguistic mistake, but instead of accepting responsibility for the mistake, what they said was, this was an incompetent reader. Any competent reader would have realized that although it says installed, it meant stored. Even though in the same label, installed is used again with its meaning of installed. So his first claim was that any competent reader should have understood that although it said it installed, it didn't mean installed. His second claim was where do we find it? You are told never to locate the grill in a building without an approved ventilation system. What he said was, there are no approved ventilation systems in Canada. There are no approved ventilation systems in Canada. So the purchaser couldn't install an approved ventilation system because there are none. So my point was, you can't do that. If you say you can't install it without an approved ventilation system, this is what some linguists call a factive statement. It means there are approved ventilation systems. Otherwise, you can't talk about installing it without one. And whimsically, I quoted Alice in Wonderland to the judges. I said, there's something similar happens in Alice in Wonderland, where, have some wine, the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked around. There was nothing on it but tea. I don't see any wine, she remarked. There isn't any, said the March Hare. Exactly the same thing. If you say have some wine, you're assuming that there is some wine to have, and yet he says, no, there wasn't any. It's the same thing. Don't do this without a approved ventilation system. But by the way, there isn't one. And by the way, although we said installed, we meant stored. Like so many cases, this one didn't actually go to court. So we weren't able to find out how the evidence would have been accepted in a court. But interestingly, the company settled out of court. So the purchaser got financial compensation, but we don't know how much, and we don't know what were the bases on which they eventually agreed to pay. But at least the solicitors for the purchaser told me that the report I'd produced had been helpful, which is about as far as you often get with lawyers. They say it was helpful. But as I say, this is just one example case, but there are many, many cases where the product warnings are not sufficiently clear for the purchaser, but often they are sufficient to protect the producer. And my student is finding several cases in Brazilian courts, and we haven't yet found a single case where a claimant has won. To the outside world, it looks as if there are various reasons for the claimant to claim that the warning wasn't sufficient, but in each case the court has decided with the producer rather than the purchaser. So as I say, one of the things that we hope we'll be able to do after analysing is to make suggestions for improving the quality of warnings. But so far as we can see at the moment, both the agency which regulates medicine information in Britain and the one which regulates it in Brazil are insufficiently aware of or don't care sufficiently about the communicability of the texts that they produce. Far too often the texts are slightly altered versions of texts which have been written by medical researchers for doctors, and the laicization, the making of the text easy for users of the medicines, that there doesn't seem to be enough emphasis on this. I think the people who are controlling the warnings are not sufficiently aware of how many people have fairly low competence in actually reading written texts, and the sentences are often too long, the vocabulary is too complicated, and the message is not easy to get at. What is always done really well is the protection for the producer rather than the protection for the purchaser or the consumer. I'm going to stop there because Dr. Fernando said that he would like to have several of the people who are working here in UNAM make presentations, and that would really interest me to find out what is the kind of work that's going on here, and are there things that I can take away and report back in Brazil. Thank you.
Bueno, sí. Voy a presentar dos proyectos en los que he estado trabajando junto con otros colegas y después van a escuchar algunas presentaciones más específicas sobre uno de estos proyectos. No, de hecho sobre los dos. Y creo que nos va a dar tiempo para que después Margarita también hable de otro proyecto que también está conectado con estos, porque estamos en redes de proyectos. Voy a continuar en inglés para facilitar la comunicación con Malcolm Coulthard. Algunos de las personas que van a hablar después de mí van a hablar en español, otros van a hablar en inglés. I want to outline two projects I'm working on with other people. Two projects that are now interconnected, each of which has been linked to other projects and is linked to some recent ones. And those form part of some long-term endeavors. I'm sorry, but I will be reading frequently in order to be able to present it in not a very long time. Okay, one project is aims to study some discourses by Mexico's Supreme Court presidents. The purpose of the other one is to develop tailor-fit computer tools for discourse analysts. The first project, I have been working mainly with Margarita Palacios and with Eduardo Hernández and Alejandra Chavarria. This project which is interesting in its own terms, but which perhaps is also relevant to the development of general frameworks for forensic discourse studies. Understanding forensic discourse in the third sense that Malcolm Coulthard has considered yesterday and the day before yesterday, i.e. to mean the use of language as evidence. We want to contribute to answer this question. Is the variability of discourse parameters between two people always greater than the variability within one person? Coulthard has made a series of remarks and observations around this kind of worry. He talked about, he asked how unique was uniqueness. The first day, today he said he wanted to know which variation depended on the user and which variations depended on the use. This is the kind of question we want to deal with. And I think that although the Supreme Court magistrates are neither plaintiffs nor defendants, the opportunities that we have when we study them will provide us with basic knowledge that can later be applied to other realms on user variability and use variability. We want to break that big question down into other more specific ones about a series of parameters, starting with the following ones. Lexical extension, vocabulary breadth, word repetition rate, mean utterance length, and syntactic complexity. For the moment, understanding them the way they are paraphrased in parentheses. Of course, some of these, especially syntactic complexity, might in the future be seen as a complex feature itself and required to be broken down into other features. We hope that in the future we will be able to consider measures of some features which should be strongly author-dependent, such as lexical availability, as well as other features which could be lightly author-dependent, such as semantic density, i.e. number of lexemes within a semantic sphere, both for common and uncommon semantic spheres. Of course, deriving specific questions from the general one I presented before regarding the set parameters and features will require discourse typologies along register considerations for the device of which we are beginning to gather conditions of production data, and we hope at some point we will also be able to consider other sorts of typologies, mainly along genre considerations. Though I will not get much into those points, though I will not get much into those points in some connection with them, I believe we could also explore the potential of discourse analysis to provide the sort of elements that might lead to the reconstruction of communicative events and of scenes communicative events are part of. Perhaps we could also try to attribute agents' responsibilities in those events and scenes. Making an effort to imagine the long-term application of what we discover now to the study of other corpora, I think we ought to learn from Alfonso Quiroz Cuarón, who insisted that forensic medicine should be concerned with the requirements of both sound medical inference and valid forensic argumentation. This is, after all, what other forensic disciplines, such as forensic chemistry and forensic ballistics, did when they were established as part of forensic science, to devise methods of empirical observation for the assessment of opportunities and motives. Along these lines, I think we could try to find if the use of certain linguistic resources tends to correlate with the adoption of certain perspectives when court members refer to the court's own proceedings, and if, in turn, perspectives tend to correlate or not with the roles played in those proceedings by the members. For example, we might try to apprehend the conditions of use of first-person forms of propositional attitude verbs and of third-person forms of communication verbs. Propositional attitude verbs are verbs like I think, I believe, I affirm. Communication verbs are verbs like I say, I tell, and so on. Of course, there are verbs which are in the intersection between the two sets, and that will make life a bit difficult. But I think we need both types of categories. Now, taking forensic analysis in the second sense considered by Coulthard, i.e. as focusing on the language of legal processes, we want to focus initially on the Supreme Court's precedents' descriptions of cases this court accepts and rejects. Since the Supreme Court's main role in the judicial system is to maintain the system's hierarchy, and it performs this role by defining what is its matter and what should be considered by other courts. Probably we should initially distinguish between descriptions presupposed by referential expressions and descriptions stated by means of predicative expressions. Oops. We know that in many fields people treat what is presupposed differently from what they want to state for various reasons, and it is expected that they should, although of course sometimes they treat as a presupposition what they should be concerned with dealing with, and vice versa. I mean, they use the distinction between presupposition and assertion strategically, which again is can be quite interesting even if it can introduce additional complications. Well, I'm sorry, I'll try to go on while they fix this. So we might want to distinguish between presupposed descriptions and asserted descriptions. And then among presupposed descriptions, we want to distinguish those that are carried on by referential expressions in thematic from those that are carried by referential expressions in non-thematic positions, because, as is well known, presupposition and assertion have different consequences for the development of a discourse and tend to imply different relations to other discourses, which is also the case with thematic and non-thematic placement of expressions. The questions we had there, which reflect these concerns, are how is the importance of rejected or accepted cases reflected in presupposed and stated descriptions? And question 3, do presupposed or accepted descriptions frame cases differently, e.g. in relation to constitutional issues or secondary laws? Well, we hope this is fixed. I want to say that we're interested in this for various reasons. One idea is that the precedents should reflect what the court thinks as a court, and not only what they think as individuals. But also because there is exploratory, preliminary evidence that the precedents set ways that the court has to follow afterwards, i.e. that the court deals with issues differently depending on the precedent, on the person holding the presidential seat at the moment. And that has many, many implications. Now, we think the study of, I'm going to go ahead even if we don't have the PowerPoint slide, I'm sorry. Now we think the study of discourse by the Supreme Court's presidents can be important for forensic discourse studies in a sense that matters much to our university seminar on forensic discourse, one which Margarita always points to and which echoes the etymology of the word forensic. One sense of the word forensic that Michael Coulthard hasn't mentioned, and perhaps it's not very important elsewhere, but it is interesting and important here. That has to do with the study of public forums, or perhaps I should say fora, where conditions for the observance or transgression of the law are set and maintained. In Mexico, the Supreme Court is not only the head of the judicial system, but also the country's constitutional court, and therefore it interacts with, or more properly speaking, its discourse sets keys for interactions among bodies of the judiciary, legislative, and executive branches of the state, and is frequently the focus of media attention. I am particularly interested in the combination and the tensions among okay. Muchas gracias, Azucena. Thank you. Okay. Okay, these are the ones I read when the machine went down. And this is what I'm getting into now. I am particularly interested in the combination and the tensions among deliberation, alignment, and contest in public fora. Because this is an area of democracy research where political sociology and discourse science meet. The more deliberative state bodies are, especially in the judiciary and legislative branches, the more legitimate state decisions ought to be in a democracy. Correspondingly, law enforcement actions ought to be more acceptable when the law is established and interpreted mainly as the result of deliberation rather than negotiation or imposition. I won't get into the distinctions between these modes of discourse interaction, but I just present some tables dealing with that problem, which we used in a paper that's already published. The point is that the Supreme Court's discourse offers excellent opportunities for theoretical and methodological research on deliberation. Because all minutes of court sessions are available online and all speeches delivered by court ministers in all sorts of settings are published in the court's annual report. For example, it should be possible to check if different operational definitions of deliberation yield highly correlating results or not. If you explore the literature on deliberation, you will see that there is a need for a good operational definition. And you will see that some candidates are change of mind. Some others believe that when political actors change their mind, it is because there has been deliberation. This is questionable. I will only say that people can change their mind for many causes and not only because they understand what the other people are saying and because they agree with what other people are saying. Another candidate is recognition of other speakers' premises in one's own discourse, and we believe this is a better candidate, and we have argued in favor of this, but we would want empirical evidence of the sort that the study of the court's discourses can provide. And one potentially good, practical, cheap operational definition could be convergence of discourse parameters of the sort I mentioned in the first questions. Now, besides being interesting for theoretical and methodological issues, some interesting analysis on the supposed perspectives of the court are feasible. For example, we could check if the neutrality that deliberation builds is reflected in the time allotted to comparable cases, classified by theme and validity claims, or whether duration and hence neutrality are affected by plaintiff. Okay. I know that considering time as a variable introduces as many problems as it solves and should be discussed in its own terms, but I won't get into that today. If there is time afterwards and you're interested in that, I would want to hear what you have to say about that as well. Or we might some other occasion. Now, all these concerns lead us to think of the possibility of establishing dynamic models and weigh the contribution of different factors involved in a public forum discourse. So this kind of questions summarizes many of the worries and interests that I've put forth before. Now, we have been gathering a corpus that will be analyzed to start answering questions like the ones I presented here, or rather Alejandra and Eduardo have been gathering, organizing, labeling and documenting the corpus, and they have started its analysis. They will talk about this later on. Let me just say that this is a corpus that will grow or will be connected to other corpora as the analysis unfolds and allows us to move along the ladder of questions I have shown. And this enlargement will be guided by the analysis itself. That is, very often one wants to have the corpus completely defined before starting, but perhaps it's better to let the analysis guide the enlargement and redefinition of the corpus. Working along these lines will require that we develop computer tools that will be similar to others that already exist, but not quite like those that already exist. Very probably it will also require that we combined the new tools with existing ones. But this is precisely one reason we're delving into the development of the new tools. The existing ones are not easily combinable as they are now. Eduardo will talk a little about this when he presents his work with Alejandra on the Quartz corpus, because they have been following a system I designed. Initially, building upon an idea a student who is not here taught me. His name is Sergio Padilla. What he came up with is that it is possible to verticalize. Have I lost the... Yep. He came up with the idea that it is possible to verticalize a line of work, a line of our work file by substituting.
Creo que yo se lo describí ya.
That's one way of analyzing discourse. One way of going about doing the analysis is to derive a bundle of files in different formats, and therefore stored and named with different suffixes, e.g. .html, to derive this bundle of files from the text, speech, or sign language delivery that was the discourse's signifier originally. Of course, involving scanned copies, transcriptions, and codings of properties. When this is not a digital written text. I gather similar approaches of producing bundles of files have been developing for other purposes, some of them general, in the world of computer science. And now there are even some programming languages designed to facilitate that kind of work. In our case, the crucial point is that not all formats are well suited for all purposes. Sometimes we need to locate words by reference to the place in paragraphs and utterances, e.g., when we are presenting research results. And hence we want to number paragraphs and utterances, which is easily done in a database, such as Excel. But sometimes we need to segment, underline, or label utterances, which is best done in a word processor rather than a database. And sometimes we need to count words or other units, but when we count the original words, our numbers, segmentation marks, and labels get in the way. In fact, the word processor formatting invisible marks also get in the way. That is why we want .txt file in our files in our bundle. TXT files are a sort of non-format, but TXT is a sort of non-format format which linguistic engineers use a lot. I have specified the steps to produce one such bundle and do certain operations with some of them, such as counting and numbering. I have used the system before and published with Sergio some results we obtained using it in a project on deliberation in Mexico's regime transformations. Alejandra and Eduardo have been following that system in exploratory work on the court's corpus, and they have been in communication with Marcio Martinez, who is here, who has been automatizing the system to obtain a first degree in computing science. And he, Marcio, has been working under the supervision of Carlos Mendez, who I think is also here. Marcio has also received orientation from Azucena Montes and of course from Margarita. So after Eduardo, Marcio and Carlos will also speak. If there's time afterwards, we might comment on how Marcio's outcome could allow us to combine machine and human analysis in ways that help to improve both. So I now give the microphone to Eduardo. Thank you.
Esta parte será en español. El proyecto decidimos llamarlo Recuperación, Sistematización y Etiquetado del Corpus de la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación, de los presidentes Guillermo Ortiz Mayagoitia y Juan Silva Mesa. Es un trabajo interdisciplinario y sí quiero hacer hincapié en esto, porque sin la ayuda de estas tres instituciones no hubiésemos logrado nada. Participa el Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales, el Seminario Universitario de Estudios del Discurso Forense y el Grupo de Ingeniería Lingüística. Nuestro objetivo principal fue desarrollar una herramienta computacional que permita el análisis de los discursos de la Suprema Corte de Justicia, que es el máximo tribunal de impartición de justicia en nuestro país. Nuestro corpus se basó en un principio en la recuperación de los últimos discursos presidenciales de Guillermo Ortiz Mayagoitia, cuyo periodo presidencial fue de 2007 a 2010, y de Juan Silva Mesa, de 2011 a 2014. Posteriormente se realizó una búsqueda de las sesiones públicas ordinarias del Pleno de la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación correspondiente a estos dos presidentes. La diferencia principal entre uno y otro es que mientras los discursos presidenciales la extensión es de aproximadamente 2 cuartillas, las sesiones públicas ordinarias del Pleno tienen 20 cuartillas y son versiones transcritas tal y como sucedieron. En este sentido podemos observar la interacción que existe entre todos los ministros. Para el análisis que presentamos posteriormente, seleccionamos 5 discursos. 2 de Ortiz Mayagoitia, 2 de Silva Mesa y una sesión de Pleno. Nuestro método tiene principalmente cuatro fases. La primera fase es la recuperación del corpus, la segunda fase fue el diseño del programa, la tercera la evaluación de este programa, ¿no? El diseño del programa se hizo manual, la evaluación del programa se hizo manual y computacional. Y finalmente el análisis, que fue la cuarta fase. Nuestro proceso cuenta con 12 pasos. Partimos de un archivo original, que lo entendimos como aquel archivo escrito o impreso, y finalizamos con un archivo que llamamos contadas, que es un archivo en Excel, donde tenemos elementos contados y frecuencias. El segundo archivo que tenemos, o del que partimos nosotros, fue de un archivo que decidimos llamar bandeja. Este archivo se llamó bandeja porque es un archivo PDF que recuperamos de la página de la Suprema Corte de Justicia de la Nación, y por eso decidimos llamarlo así. El tercer archivo lo llamamos fuente, es un archivo en Word, donde lo que hicimos fue, además de convertir el PDF a Word, unificar todo el formato, darle un mismo tipo de letra, que en este caso fue Times New Roman, 12 puntos, interlineado 1.5 y márgenes iguales y numeración. La siguiente etapa, el siguiente archivo se llamó remarcado. La diferencia principal entre este y es que comenzamos a colocarle ciertas marcas para posteriormente realizar un listado y obtener las frecuencias. En este caso, vemos la marca de párrafo que está acá, la marca de enunciado que está acá. Si nosotros observamos leemos que aquí inicia un párrafo, inicia un enunciado. El enunciado es y acá tenemos otro inicio de enunciado. Posteriormente, el archivo 5 se llamó para numerar. Es un archivo en Word todavía, en el que decidimos enlistar todos los elementos para colocarlos en un archivo en Excel, que fue el siguiente documento, que se llamó que numera. Este archivo en Excel recupera los elementos de la lista anterior, realizamos una numeración de estos archivos y comenzamos a hacer con base en los símbolos anteriores, comenzamos a hacer la numeración de párrafos, la numeración de enunciados y la numeración de palabras, que posteriormente fueron concatenados en la columna F para que se pueda recuperar esa información en una sola columna. Por ejemplo, tenemos la palabra política. Está en el párrafo 1, es el enunciado número 1 y es la palabra número 9. En estas dos columnas colocamos los mismos elementos, solo que indicando que no forman parte del discurso que estamos analizando. El archivo número 7, recuperamos la columna anterior, que es esta, la columna H, para colocar o para indicar que ese archivo tiene ciertas marcas, que son estas. donde podemos leer fácilmente en qué párrafo está, qué enunciado es y qué palabra la recuperaríamos de los archivos anteriores. El siguiente archivo, que se llamó para limpiar, recuperamos solamente la información que nos sirve, ¿no? Y además comenzamos a eliminar fórmulas, porque las columnas anteriores tenían fórmulas que en este archivo que en los archivos posteriores no nos dejan manipular los datos fácilmente. Entonces, en este archivo dejamos el orden secuencial de palabras, el vector de posición, que son estos tres elementos, numeración de palabras, numeración de párrafo, numeración de enunciado, y los elementos. Tuvimos un séptimo archivo que se llamó que limpia. Este tiene el orden secuencial de las palabras, el vector de posición, los elementos que habíamos recuperado del archivo anterior y comenzamos a limpiar todas, a quitar la puntuación. Comenzamos con la puntuación izquierda, después la derecha, así hasta la última columna, que es en donde tenemos los elementos limpios, los elementos sin ninguna marca, sin ningún signo de puntuación, para que posteriormente podamos hacer el análisis más fácilmente. En el décimo archivo, que se llamó para contar, comenzamos a enumerar y a recuperar esta información que nos va sirviendo para crear en el penúltimo archivo un conteo de todas las palabras funcionales, ¿no? En la primera columna, si lo pueden ver, está la numeración de cada uno de los elementos. Comenzamos a ordenar alfabéticamente los elementos para eliminar cada una de las casillas que no nos sirven. Es decir, en esta columna, en la C, en la B, tenemos 1916. 1916 aparece una vez. 1917 aparece 1, 2, 3 veces. En la columna D, la instrucción que le dimos fue que nos dé solo el resultado de cuántas veces aparece esa palabra. Por eso, en esta casilla y en esta no aparece ningún número, o aparece 0, mientras que en la última aparece el resultado de las palabras, de la frecuencia de palabras que tenemos. Y finalmente, en el décimo archivo, tenemos la frecuencia de cada una de las palabras que están en el discurso. Constitucional, por ejemplo, aparece 11 veces. Constitución aparece 10 veces. Nuestro aparece 10 veces y así podemos observar cada uno de los elementos y qué es a lo que se le da más preponderancia en el discurso que se está manejando. Realizamos también un pequeño análisis con base en los 5 archivos que les mencioné en un principio. Uno de estos es el de la derecha. Bueno, sí, el de la derecha. Es sobre la inauguración de la tercera Asamblea General Ordinaria de la Asociación Mexicana de Impartidores de Justicia. Se dijo el 14 de noviembre de 2008 y tenemos con base en la frecuencia anterior, que el tema base, el tópico es la justicia. La justicia aparece 13 veces. Evidentemente la institución es lo que también va a aparecer, el AMIG, ¿no? Y hay acción. Tenemos que el verbo tenemos, ¿no? Aparece en 4 ocasiones y ahí está. En estas 3, tanto la de la izquierda como estas 2 que siguen, abordan el tema de la promulgación de la Constitución Política de los Estados Unidos Mexicanos, ¿no? Uno fue pronunciado por Guillermo Ortiz Mayagoitia, los otros 2 fueron pronunciados por Juan Silva Mesa en años diferentes. El primero fue del 5 de febrero de 2008. El segundo, este de acá, fue del 5 de febrero de 2011. y el tercero fue el 5 de febrero de 2012. En el primero tenemos que, aunque estén hablando de la Constitución, lo que más les interesa es el poder. El poder es el que está presente. Tenemos diferentes campos semánticos y el más grande es este de acá, el que está en azul, que aborda el tema de la justicia, lo judicial y lo jurídico. Es el poder judicial, el poder jurídico que se da en nuestro país en este momento, y la Constitución queda en segundo término, tiene menos frecuencia. En este de acá sí es congruente entre lo que se está diciendo y lo que en realidad se habla. Es la Constitución y lo constitucional. En ambos casos, lo que más se presenta. Hay una misma estructura por parte de estos dos. Tenemos adverbios, como es el caso de hoy, cuya frecuencia es similar. Tenemos mexicanos, en este tenemos México. En este tenemos una acción que es debemos, aprobación, las instituciones, que también aparece en esta parte, y los valores. Otro hecho importante es que se retoma o se habla de la revolución como un hecho histórico traído a la actualidad, mientras que en este caso no se retoma ese hecho histórico. Y finalmente, el análisis de la sesión pública ordinaria del Pleno de la Suprema Corte de Justicia durante el periodo de Juan Silva Mesa. Elegimos este discurso porque es la elección presidencial de Juan Silva Mesa, es decir, cuando Mayagoitia deja el poder y lo adquiere Juan Silva Mesa. Entonces, lo que tenemos presente aquí, o a lo que se le da más relevancia, es al señor ministro, en donde hay acuerdos, en donde está un presidente. También está presente la Suprema Corte de Justicia como aquel órgano en el que se va a adquirir poder, y el secretario, obviamente, que debe avalar esos acuerdos del Estado.
Hello to everyone. I'm going to talk about the technical implementation of the procedure. First of all, we decided to use the programming language for Microsoft Office called macros, which are defined as a series of commands and instructions that group together as a single command to accomplish a task automatically. We chose it because it was the easiest way to distribute to other people who could be interested in any segment of the procedure. We also choose it because it doesn't require any specific knowledge for its use. And the outputs are the same as the manual procedure, so it could be more comfortable for the speech analyst. And here's a representation of the outputs, which are basically the same as explained before. In summary, the macro build files according to the transformations with all the rules. And I think that's all.
Perdón, falta comentar una parte. Actualmente el proceso también se está ejecutando en un corpus que tiene la doctora, que es sobre la trata de personas. Están trabajando Norberto y Jessica. Este corpus tiene 70 archivos, que son leyes, acuerdos, convenios, convenciones, informes y declaraciones, tanto internacionales como nacionales, y se obtuvo principalmente de páginas electrónicas gubernamentales, como la Organización de las Naciones Unidas. Gracias.
Y bueno, una última cosa es que la idea también de este proyecto es que se pueda utilizar para todos los que necesiten un análisis más específico sobre el recuento de palabras. También puede ser aplicado para cualquier otro tema. Entonces, si quieren pueden pedirlo o y ya se los podemos pasar y explicar cómo funciona para que lo ejecuten en sus computadoras. ¿Este de quién es?
Bueno, no sé si hay alguna pregunta. No hay preguntas.
Yo quiero hacer un comentario. Quiero felicitar a los jóvenes. Es que de veras dominen su tema y lo presentaron de manera fenomenal y muchas felicidades.
Malcolm, do you want to have a question? No, thank you. Bueno, pues no me queda más que dar las gracias a Azucena Montes, tuvo que salir rápidamente. Y bueno, me queda más que dar las gracias, por supuesto, al doctor Malcolm Coulthard, que nos hizo favor de participar y estar con nosotros durante este tiempo. Muchas gracias. Por supuesto, a todo el equipo que trabajó, que todos están aquí. La verdad, todo esto no hubiera sido posible sin la ayuda de todo el grupo de ingeniería y el grupo que bondadosamente ha trabajado desde la facultad. Si les menciono a todos, no terminamos. Dar las gracias al grupo de ingeniería lingüística, al Instituto de Investigaciones Sociales, al Instituto de Investigaciones Jurídicas que nos ha albergado. Y sí quisiera muy especialmente dar las gracias a Alejandra y a Lilia, que han sido un poco el cuerpo motor y quien ha sostenido cada día nuestras presencias. Muchísimas gracias. Aquí hay algo que quieren decir.
Perdón que haya sido tan tarde. Bueno, buenos días a todos. No pertenezco a la UNAM, trabajo en la Procuraduría del Distrito Federal y trabajo en el Laboratorio de Acústica Forense. Quería nada más primero felicitarlos a los jóvenes, comentar que en el 2009 yo estaba haciendo un proyecto igual, utilizando Word y Excel soy ingeniero, para hacer un recuento de palabras y ver, pero sobre delincuentes. Entonces, no sé si en un momento dado con alguno de ustedes me pueda yo poner en contacto, precisamente para continuar un proyecto que dejé en el 2009, pero sobre bases de datos y voces criminales. Entonces, a sus órdenes, mi nombre es Víctor Zamora, y gracias y felicidades por esta plática tan interesante desde antier.
Gracias, Víctor. Yo creo que la persona indicada está callada.
Sí, pues con mucho gusto platicamos. Ahorita te doy los datos del grupo y adelante, ¿no?
Bueno, pues si no hay más preguntas, muchísimas gracias. Yo quisiera que despidiéramos con un muy caluroso aplauso al doctor Malcolm Coulthard. Y quiero darle las gracias también muy personalmente a Azucena y a Fernando. Nada de lo que se está haciendo hubiera sido en su origen posible sin ellos dos. Muchísimas gracias. Y eso es mío. Gracias. No olviden recoger sus constancias, después es muy difícil entregárselas. La grabación va a estar tanto en la página de Jurídicas como en la de SUEDIF y a lo mejor también la podemos poner en la red de ingeniería para todos aquellos que les interese. Muchísimas gracias.